as I'm telling my panel and my distinguished speakers, of course, I'll be learning alongside you. I am an infrastructure person, I'm an engineer, so don't know much about financing. No, really, but these are all brand new to me, and I'm really excited for this session to learn alongside you all. Okay, shall we start? So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Cindy Cisneros Tianco. I'm newly minted director for the Emerging Areas Team, Energy Sector Office of the ADB, and I am your moderator for what is set out to be an engaging session. So this afternoon, we will be exploring deployment of innovative financing schemes and risk mitigation practices that can support the growth of emerging sectors and technologies in the clean energy space. We have an amazing lineup of speakers coming from the private sector, the ADB, and the United Nations. To open the session, I would like to welcome on stage Craig Roberts, Senior Advisor from the Private Sector Operations Department of ADB, to deliver the welcome address.
So maybe I'll get in a quick qualifier. I'm a banker, not an engineer. So to the engineers in the room, I'm looking forward to learning from you guys. So good afternoon to everybody. Very, very happy to welcome you to this session, which focuses on operations, and it's all about the deployment of innovative financing schemes in emerging sectors and technologies. And this is organized by the Private Sector Operations Department, but we're very pleased to welcome Cindy from the sector side of the bank as part of the 20th anniversary of the Asia Clean Energy Forum. And I think this is quite a good step forward to focus in on operations. This year's theme, Empowering Our Future Through Clean Energy Innovations, Regional Cooperation and Integration and Financing Solutions, is very timely. As we all gather here today over the next few days, all of the sessions remind us of both the urgency and the scale of the clean energy transition and the very critical role that innovation and finance combined must play in shaping all of our futures. For the very first time, the Asia Clean Energy Forum has introduced these sessions, which are focused on operations and are put together and curated by different regional departments and operational themes, and supported obviously by clients and other parties. These sessions are really designed to complement the broader workshops which you've all been part of and the dialogues taking place throughout the week. And they help bring, I think, a much sharper focus on the practical operational aspects of clean energy deployment. Today, we spotlight on innovation, and that's not just about technology, well, that's a very important part of it, but also how we can use innovative finance instruments to scale the technological solutions. We all know that deploying clean energy technologies at scale is not just the technical challenge. It's also fundamentally, how do we finance that? The question is not just about what technology is available, but how we can mobilize capital, particularly from the private sector, how we can de-risk investments for other investors, and how we can create enabling environments in all of our developing member countries that then allow these technologies to thrive. This session will be focused on that. We will dive into de-risking mechanisms, blended finance structures, and other innovative financial solutions that will be and are essential to support the deployment of emerging technology, whether that be green hydrogen, ammonia, offshore wind, technologies that perhaps we don't even know about today. Very happy and privileged to be joined here by a panel of experts We've got a great external speaker, Peter, to do the introductory address from the United Nations Industrial Development Organization. We have Mudit, a real-life CFO, used to be a banker, we already had that conversation. But very importantly, right, you've got a number of people, my colleagues from private sector operations and Cindy, that are going to talk about what we can do as a financier, but critically important to us are our partners, and critically important are our clients who actually deliver those technologies. They do the hard work. Right? We do the easy work. We provide the finance. They provide the technology, the knowledge, and the deployment. And it's really important to have clients represented in these panels. So I'm very happy to welcome you. And as I said, we've got a number of people from across ADB and from across my department, which do slightly different things, but all with the same aim of delivering what we can on behalf of an MDB. They're going to share insights on how new technologies are being deployed across multiple markets, and how institutions like multinational development banks can act as catalytic partners to enable private sector participation. Here at ADB, we recognize whenever a new and promising technology enters the market, there are often concerns around bankability and the ability to attract investment. Very often, investors are relatively simple and financiers are relatively simple. Anything new, they think risk. And those are very valid concerns. But they shouldn't deter us in this room. Instead, they should motivate us to explore how we can de-risk these investments and build that investor confidence, which is a key part of my job, all of our jobs, that then help scale up those solutions that are essential for our energy future. And it's not just about ADB deploying finance, but critically important is us bringing other investors and building that risk appetite. Mobilization is a very hot topic amongst multilateral development banks, and we are actively mobilizing resources to support this effort, and we'll do more. Through our energy policy, we are committed to aligning our operations with the goals of the Paris Agreement, phasing out coal, and prioritizing investments in renewable energy, energy efficiency, and grid modernization. We're also scaling up the use of guarantees, concessional finance, and blended instruments to help crowd in the private capital that's so needed and reduce the risk profile of clean energy and new technology investments. This commitment was reaffirmed during our recent annual meeting, where ADB announced its commitment to scale up private sector development and aiming to increase private sector financing fourfold to 13 billion annually by 2030. This reflects our recognition that the private sector is not just a partner, but it is the key driver of innovation, scale, and sustainability. We must also acknowledge the broader context in which we're operating. Climate change is the defining challenge of our time, and Asia and the Pacific is one of the most vulnerable regions in the world. Rising temperatures, more frequent and intense natural disasters, shifting climate patterns, all of these are already affecting millions of lives and threatening hard-won development gains. And millions of lives, particularly those in the poorer segments of society, those we truly exist to serve. In this context, new energy technologies are not just desirable, they are essential, they are critical. They need to meet the region's growing energy demands while ensuring a just, inclusive, and sustainable transition to clean energy. By 2040, Asia and the Pacific will account for nearly 2/3 of global energy demand growth. This is driven by the region's dynamic economic expansion through trade and integration, supply chain diversification, digital transformation, and its emergence as a global innovation hub. Meeting this demand sustainably will require of all of us bold action, innovative thinking, and very, very strong partnerships. We're already seeing promising developments, the emergence of green ammonia and hydrogen, the construction of offshore wind projects, and the growing importance of critical minerals in clean energy supply chains. These are not just technology breakthroughs. They're also opportunities to reshape entire energy systems, create new industries, and build more resilient economies. To realize this potential, we need to mobilize capital at scale. We need to build enabling ecosystems, we need to create new industries, and we need to build more resilient economies. As we begin today's session, I invite all of you, colleagues, partners, stakeholders, to join us in this journey. Let us work together to unlock the full potential of innovative financing and accelerate the deployment of new clean technologies, building a resilient, inclusive, low-carbon future for Asia and the Pacific. So I thank you for your attention this afternoon, and I look forward to the session we're about to have, both the keynote address and the panel discussion. So Cindy, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Craig. And indeed, this is a groundbreaking version of the ASEF in its 20 years of implementation. In addition to private sector development shift, our president, after the annual meeting in May, also emphasized the need for collaboration, particularly cross-sector collaborations, to deploy integrated solutions, and that includes, of course, private sector participation. So with that, I'd like to invite you to our tomorrow's session of cross-sector solutions under the Emerging Areas theme, and that is essentially where we can find the emerging type of solutions that the private sector can actually finance. So indeed, as Craig mentioned, there is a huge opportunity and need to enable innovative financing solutions in emerging energy technologies. And MDBs, like the ADB, play a huge role to provide financing and de-risk investments to further encourage private sector participation. To deliver our keynote address, an esteemed speaker from the United Nations Industrial Development Organization will be highlighting financing approaches gaining traction in developing countries, as well as potential solutions for mobilizing private investments, including opportunities in technological, regulatory, and market challenges limiting the growth. Without further ado, please welcome on stage Peter Warren.
Great. Well, thanks very much to the ADB for inviting me here to the Asia Clean Energy Forum, and it's great to be back here. But what I also think is fantastic is that there's a whole thematic track dedicated to innovative financing this year. And that's quite, I think, unusual for the ASEF, so it's fantastic that we see that. You know, there was some great sessions yesterday afternoon that I joined, some really interesting presentations and speakers across the region on different types of financing mechanisms, whether it was case studies of guarantees in Nepal or blended finance instruments used in Indonesia. It was really fascinating to see the actual good case studies, the positive messages. But I think, as Cindy said, there are still challenges out there that we want to overcome. But the more that we can talk about the positive stories, I think the better. So what I'm going to present in this presentation is some results for some new assessments that we commissioned that were published at COP29 in November. Now, we actually have a few at the back, so if anyone wants to go to the back and grab a copy. These reports are quite big, okay? So they are like 300 pages long, and no one's going to sit through 300 pages and read that. So we've got 4-page leaflet summaries. So if you do want to get the top headlines in the space, we have some copies at the back, and we've got the online QR code as well. So in terms of emerging sectors, there's 4 main areas I'll cover. So I think Cindy and Craig mentioned a couple of them. So critical minerals, clean hydrogen, industrial decarbonization, so manufacturing and processing decarbonization, and also smart energy and the digitalization agenda. So I'm going to focus mainly on those 4 areas, taking some of the results from these new market assessments. Now, these market assessments, I think, are they're very practical. So they look at the landscape of a whole range of areas, such as the landscape of innovators and technologies that are out there right now, the landscape of financing mechanisms that allowed actual projects that are existing now to come to fruition. And that's the key thing. So if you want to see, at least as of COP last year, what projects exist out there, what was their financing packages, what are the types of technologies in those 4 areas of critical minerals, clean hydrogen, smart energy, and industry, then do have a look at those. So I'm mainly going to sort of touch on that. So if this works. Okay, I think we've got some tech issues here. There we go. So as Cindy said, really this session is about looking at innovative approaches that are gaining traction, particularly across Asia Pacific. And I think in the previous session before the break, the moderator, Director of Private Infrastructure Finance, mentioned how the only sustainable form of finance is private finance. So I think what we're trying to do here is look at how can you use a small bit of catalytic donor support and grant funding to then crowd in the private investment for that longer term scalability. So there's a role of both the MDBs, UN agencies like the one I work for, to then try to catalyze that so that you can actually support longer term development. And that's the crucial thing, that we're not supporting projects that have no plan, long-term plan, no scalability, no commercial viability, but actually using the small amount of funding that is available now, particularly in the current climate, to really catalyze those transformational solutions. So I think that's the key sort of message from my keynote. I think the battery's broken on this. Thanks. Great, so I'm going to skip over that. So for those that don't know UNIDO, so it's the UN's organization and specialized agency that focuses on sustainable and inclusive industrial development. So it's really the agency that works primarily with the private sector, with industries, ministries of industry in developing countries across the world, so Asia Pacific, Africa, and Latin America. And it's got 3 main areas of focus. So sustainable supply chains, so across the whole supply chain, limiting climate breakdown, so climate action, clean energy, digitalization, agribusiness, a whole range of work on that area, and then ending hunger as well. So what we're doing with SDG 2, but it's the main agency focused on SDG 9, on innovation infrastructure development for the UN. So these market assessments I mentioned, we've got some links here, but I'm going to go into some of the detail on those 4 areas that I mentioned as 4 key emerging sectors. And actually, it's great to see that the ADB is really starting to grow now the portfolio on hydrogen and critical minerals. I know there's a session on critical minerals tomorrow afternoon, and hydrogen was a prominent feature of last year's ACEF. So it's good to see the projects that develop in the region. So in terms of these market assessments, there's, as you can see, some stats on here, but there's in some areas quite a plethora of projects, but in other areas like critical minerals, it's really at an earlier stage. There's not a huge number of projects out there, particularly if you look at the midstream and the downstream. So when we think of critical minerals, the first thing we probably think of is mining and extraction. But actually, a lot of the work we're doing in UNIDO is to try and look at the midstream and downstream, processing, refining, recycling, e-waste, manufacturing lithium-ion batteries, for example, and how do we sort of scale those projects and get the private finance and the financing mechanisms needed for those types of projects to go ahead. So I think that's a big area of focus for us. In clean hydrogen, across the value chain, in these market assessments, it deep dived into India, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Vietnam, where they were seen as quite strong potential from the analysis for clean hydrogen deployment. And then in smart energy and industrial decarbonisation, there's a whole range of countries that were looked at, all 141 ODA eligible countries. So ODA is the official development assistance aid eligible countries. And it went from that level across the world down to about 28, where there were pretty strong enabling environments, whether it's policy, regulation, frameworks, incentive schemes, development of the private finance industry to provide the financing, So do have a look at those market assessments. So I'm going to go into all four and give you a snapshot. I'll try not to bore you with all the technical detail. I'll try to be quite brief because there's a lot of material in those reports. So I'll just try and pick out the main sort of takeaways. But on critical minerals, as I said, really what this report focused on was the midstream and downstream. It wasn't looking at exploration or extraction, but really what is the current landscape for midstream and downstream. So in terms of some of the key findings on the finance side, because the research questions looked at, as I was saying, sort of landscape of innovators, landscape of technologies, but it also looked at financial delivery mechanisms. Now, in this, it's obviously very high level because the detail is in the report. I couldn't possibly spare. I could spend like 3 days trying to go over the 300 pages of this report. So this is just to bring out some of the key messages, but there is a detail at the country level and even at the individual project level about how those projects were structured, financing packages, what types of technology, which countries, was it technology transfer from another country, was it homegrown innovation from that country? So this is just more the bigger picture that we saw from the research. But there are a number of case studies, like in the bottom here, Prospect Innovation Accelerator Program, Textiles Sustainability Accelerator were good examples. But also from the private side, but in the multilateral space, those like the World Bank's Climate Smart Mining Initiative, which it was expanding a bit more to look at the midstream and downstream. So there's a lot of good examples out there that if you want to go into detail. And this table here is an example of the sort of level of detail. It's a really quite comprehensive piece of work. The table just shows the countries that were deep dived into for the Asia Pacific region. But if you're interested in countries in the other regions to look at how the similarities and differences, there are also similar tables as well. So for example, things that worked well in these countries were tax incentives for the technology deployment, coupled with special economic zones for industrialization. A good example is the Mineral Security Partnership as well. National finance mechanisms like in Indonesia and India. But that focus on the SDG 9 angle was one of the areas of focus. But on the MDB space, there's a case study I'm going to present in a minute, which is on a facility that we have that's trying to tackle this grant financing facility. But the World Bank also has quite a lot of programs that touch on this area. There isn't really a single facility that is dedicated at the moment to this topic, and maybe the ADB can be one of the first to establish this, and I'll be interested to ask those questions tomorrow afternoon to the ADB in the critical mineral session. So there is a big gap there on this very important emerging area, but we're trying to do what we can in UNIDO, and we're taking very specific parts of the chain, which I'll talk about in another slide. But some of the key challenges include in critical minerals the need for that greater scale. It's still very much at that pilot stage or even pre-pilot, where there's a greater need for things like feasibility studies or FEED studies is one of the big gaps generally across this space. $2 or $3 million to do a FEED study, very difficult to get donor funding to support that. Maybe 100K feasibility studies easier to get from these. So there are big gaps that are necessary to then get to the commercialization where the private finance structures are likely to come in. So the last slide on critical minerals is really just to take those key messages. So a lot of the projects to date have come because of domestic financial delivery mechanisms and tax incentives. So this is a topic where we need to look a bit more at how can we crowd in private finance. I think it's a trickier area, and we need to really put more money into innovation to be able to really accelerate that process. Also, how we work with small to medium-sized enterprises. So we have a number of programs actually in UNIDO that target SMEs and how we can help them to access international funds. Because in a lot of cases, these SMEs don't have the connections to the international funders, whether it's international banks or whether it's DFIs. So it's how you make that connection for them. And then looking at this role of how much of these projects is tech transfer versus homegrown innovation as well. So clean hydrogen I mean, this is obviously a big topic. It sort of goes in waves of interest, as a lot of people probably noticed. But in this one, we focused again, just on developing countries, 141 ODA eligible countries in this assessment across the value chain from production, transport, use, for example, in buildings and power sector, and transport, industry, which is a big focus for us. And some of the key findings that sort of came out of this is, I mean, how you sort of bring in and de-risk the investment has been a bit of a challenge, I think, in a lot of the hydrogen projects over the last few decades. But now there are some really good case studies out there that exist, and India and Malaysia were two that were deep dived into within this assessment, where you've got some good examples of how they've managed to crowd in the private finance. But one of the big messages is there's still a need for a bit of MDB/UN support in a lot of these. It's still at the stage where private sector has not come in fully yet, even with these innovative mechanisms. I will talk a bit more about innovative mechanisms at the very end, and some newer types of finance mechanism that I don't think have been talked about so far, to do with pool mechanisms. So I'll finish with that in my presentation. Where we've seen quite strong success with state-owned enterprises, for example, playing a really important role in helping to catalyze the clean hydrogen projects. So I think these are the types of replications that can be done, but we've also seen there's a lot of tech transfer from developed countries in this theme. So particularly Germany, Japan, and Norway, I think are the key ones. So in terms of like financial challenges, I know Cindy said we'd talk a bit about the challenges. So obviously most people know this, I think, but the high capital requirements for hydrogen, particularly compared to the other three themes that I'm presenting today. The amount of public funding you need to de-risk is quite high. So thinking about the innovative financing mechanisms that can use a smaller pool of funding to de-risk is something that a lot of donors are looking at the moment. But some of the sort of enabling factors, I want to make a positive story. I don't want to just focus on the challenges. I think at these conferences, we really want to say, where are the good case studies? What's worked well? How can we replicate that? So some of the key things that have come out from all of these projects, because remember, this isn't a theoretical piece. This is based on actual projects on the ground. This is where this information is coming from. So standardizing medium-term offtake agreements, use of concessional capital and guarantees. I think guarantees has come up quite a lot in the last 2 days. And that seems to be a bit of a gap across a lot of thematic areas. But also supporting on the earlier stage. So the project preparation phase. We talked about FEED studies. I think that's still going to be a tricky bit to finance, but the pre-FEED studies or the post during implementation, I think is really key. So key takeaways from this, I think I've covered most of them, but it was mentioned about the importance of collaboration in the last session as well. There were a few, two main takeaways from the previous session before the break, and collaboration was absolutely essential because it's very difficult to just grow a hydrogen project from scratch without collaboration internationally or regionally. That's what this market assessment showed compared to the other themes, which in some cases were very local. In this case, it was quite an international, almost all of the projects that we looked at. But what I'll do is I'll go into the next theme, so I want to make sure you've got enough time. I'm looking at the timer here, which is quite aggressively looking at me right now, so I'll try and just speed up a bit. So on smart energy, I know last year at ACEF there was a big focus on digitalization and the role of things like blockchain, artificial intelligence, smart grids, or just simply the underlying data infrastructure that's absolutely essential to be able to enable these advanced technologies. And in a lot of cases, that infrastructure for data is actually not there. So we looked at what types of projects exist across smart grid deployment and some of these more advanced technologies. So in terms of the findings, I think there's a big gap in the valley of death, the TRLs 3 to 4, which is technology readiness levels, 3 to 4, which is the sort of feasibility study pilot phase. And I think at that stage, there's definitely a gap. But what we found from some of our financing facilities is actually there's a lot of demand for smart energy support. Out of these 4 themes, there's a huge amount of interest in this and with really big impacts and community benefits. So a number of these technologies are starting to commercialize now. So it's now finding what parts of the digitalization agenda still require that support. because most of this can be funded by the private sector now as it is. So in terms of key takeaways, I mean, from this gap in those more advanced technologies, like the use of blockchain in, say, power grids, in buildings, in transport, what we found is they still require grants. And we've seen that, 42% of these projects still had some element of grant to bring in the private investment. And then taking that out, equity was the next main form of investment for smart energy. Didn't see as many in loans, about 13% of these projects. And in this one, it was 28 countries. And I think within each country, you're talking about 20, 30 projects that are making up these statistics. So finally, on the industry side, there's the fourth and final one. So this was looking across a whole range of sectors: manufacturing, processing. I'm going to talk a bit about some projects, that case study projects that looked at, for example, the tea industry. You got everything from the tea industry to steel and iron. A very broad range, but very different incentive structures required for that. But what we see a very similar pattern for industry. Grants still making up 44% of these projects. They may come from institutions like the UN or from the ADB, from World Bank and from others, but they're still, especially with heavy industry, to commercialize that, there's only a few companies that have done, certain technologies that have been commercialized, like carbon capture and storage. There are actually good examples of where that has been commercialized without any public funding, but they're far and few between. There's only a few examples in India where that's been the case. So grants is still a big focus, 23% equity, which I think was an interesting finding, that it was more on equity than debt instruments for this particular group of sector, but that was what we found from the existing projects. But then still a lot of multilateral and bilateral grants were needed to sort of support this. So that was the main run through of some of the market assessments. And now I was a bit thinking about the forward look, and I'm going to finish with the forward look so we can have a nice positive story. But before we do that, we do have a quick video to show. So we recently had an annual event for a case study facility that I'm going to present before I close, which is an opportunity for funding at the moment, for grant funding. So I think if we can play the video, that would be great.
I'm joined here by Karim, who's the Division Chief for Innovative Finance and International Finance Institutions at UNIDO. A really important theme of this week here at the Accelerate to Demonstrate Facility's first annual event is how do we accelerate innovative financing mechanisms to unlock private finance at demonstration projects.
Innovative finance is very important because most of the demonstration projects, they're in between commercial viability and non-commercial, but having many externalities, climate change, etc., those benefits. So normally they wouldn't be financed, and innovative finance, which includes blended finance, has actually a mix of public funds looking at externalities, climate change, and private funds, because there is still a business case in there, and mixing them in the right way and in the right mechanism can help to upscale these innovative demonstrations.
You can look at how to design demand-side catalysts to bring in technologies into the market. So combining pull finance with push finance, that provides a good blend of different incentives to attract more private capital into solutions.
What we really did was look at the macroeconomic and socioeconomic benefits, and we believe in the longer term for us, for South Africa, although it's a challenge, it will have benefits from a macroeconomic and a socioeconomic perspective, also addressing the just energy transition that we're focusing on so much.
Great, thanks. If we can go back to slides, that'd be great. And so we had our first annual event for a financing facility that I'll just briefly present before I close. And one of the key things we looked at as well was how do you accelerate the commercialization of those 4 areas through demonstration projects, which is one of the trickiest areas to get private capital into. And that's why this financing facility was set up, funded by the UK government. And my colleagues at the back from the UK government, I can see there if anyone wants to ask them more questions about this, but with the partnership between UNIDO and the UK was set up to try and get this area really sort of focused on, because if you look across the landscape of UN agencies, MDBs, this is a gap. You know, there's a plethora of climate funds out there. There's huge numbers of climate funds supporting those 4 areas except critical minerals. But the demonstration angle is a tricky one to encourage both donor support, but also get the private financing. So this financing facility is aiming to address that. But just to sort of pick up on some forward-looking potential solutions to try to end on the positive note. So how we, like in the UN and MDBs, can use grants in more innovative ways is one solution. So can you use, like for this facility, we use it for capital money, not for technical assistance. There's a huge number of technical assistance facilities out there, but how can you use grants for actual capital, for equipment, for procurement, to help de-risk, to allow private finance to come in, to help de-risk their investments? Could you use those grants in a form of guarantee model? I mean, there's not a huge number of examples of that. Hasn't really been well tested. Grants as a guarantee, for example, in clean energy. But also looking at results-based financing approaches, milestone-based financing approaches as well, to look at how the risk is shared between the two. In terms of, we talked about blended finance and guarantee mechanisms. I think I'll leave that to the panel. I think it's probably best you wait for them to talk about their experiences, so I won't sort of go onto that. But how we can use that with enhanced public-private partnerships has also been something that's come out of some of our work. But from the video, you heard from Kathy Chen from KPMG on the use of pool finance mechanisms. It's extremely underutilized in clean energy, where it's mainly been used for things like vaccine development in health and a few other good examples, but there's very few examples of pool finance in clean energy. So one thing that we can try and do is look at how do you look at things like advanced market commitments, buyers clubs, larger scale prizes, quantity linked open payments. Contracts for difference is the main one that's been used, you know, for offshore wind, like in the UK is a good example of that, and other countries are using it for other things, but particularly for things like advanced market commitments or changing green public procurement approaches to focus on these harder to abate sectors like the hydrogen, the heavy industry, critical minerals, processing and refining. There's very few examples of where that's been used. Slightly higher risk, but could be very transformational for private investment. One thing we did on Monday this week, my colleague at the back, Lorena, is our expert on this, but we organized a session dedicated to the role of environmental and social safeguards, gender equality and social inclusion as a way to de-risk private finance flows into these types of sectors. And it was a great discussion, and it showed how, you know, if you put that as core at the beginning of the project, it's going to lead to improved projects in the sense that you're not going to get cost overruns later on, or communities that don't want the project there, or 2 years down the line, it's nothing that's been promised to them is there, but actually having it from the start and improving the quality. So rather than seeing it as this tick box add-on, which historically, unfortunately, has been the case, seeing it as a core part for private financiers to see that as a benefit, that it's actually going to reduce their costs and actually get that greater community buy-in, which is essential for these clean energy projects to actually operate over 5, 10, 15 years. So we ran a whole session on that, and I think that's a bit of the piece that often is not discussed when we talk about private finance leveraging. So I only have a couple more slides, and on the timer it says 3 minutes, 40 seconds. So you've got 3 minutes, 40 seconds left of me. So I mentioned a financing facility, and that's what I'm going to finish with. It's really trying to tackle this demonstration projects part. So a lot of the stats, like from the International Energy Agency, say that 35% of emissions reductions need to come from technologies that are at the demonstration phase. Like if we just focus on only those that are commercial now, we won't hit targets. So with the funding from the UK government, around $80 million equivalent, we set up a facility in UNIDO, which aims to tackle this issue. So everything I've said so far, we're trying to address that through what we can through this facility. So it targets those 4 areas. It provides grants of about $1 to $5 million per project, with co-financing requirements of around the same amount, with an ambition to try and reach a similar amount, because it is tricky to get the co-financing, but it is one way to leverage the private sector to invest at this stage in the chain. We have a call for proposals that's currently open until the 7th of July, so if people are interested, please do have a look. I'm happy to share the information on that. But from our call that we did last year, which was the very first one, we had 5 supported projects, all with very interesting financing mechanisms, with co-financing from a whole range of sources, such as energy utilities, from international banks. In some cases, it was in-kind contributions and investments from the site themselves, because they saw that this would have a longer-term plan for scalability, and again, the private sector finance involved in that project. We presented one of those projects on Monday, a case study in Nepal of smart technologies applied to a steel factory. So I think in the room, I think I saw a couple of people from our project there. So if you want to ask them any questions, I can introduce you to them. But what it's really focusing on, as I mentioned, that there's a small amount of grant funding that's now available. So it's targeting those to where you can have the most catalytic impact. So not just supporting projects that maybe don't go anywhere, maybe they sort of don't have a clear scalability plan, there's no private finance involvement. So it's really those that have a lighthouse effect. And I think actually, Craig and Cindy briefly referenced that as well, in terms of how can we get demonstration projects that they themselves are a beacon to other projects to then show private investment, this works, we've tested it through a demonstration project, now it's ready to scale at 5, 6, 7 times that amount. So that's what we're really focused on here. I got 1 minute left on the clock, so I probably won't spend too much time on this. Just to say, we published these market assessments, 5 projects. We've got a call open, so if anyone, wants to catch me after, feel free. So I'll probably skip over this. And these are the 5 projects that we have at the moment. There's only one in the Asia Pacific region at the moment in Nepal, but we have projects in Nigeria, Kenya, Namibia, and Tanzania. So the critical minerals one is looking at lithium ion, local manufacturing for 2 3-wheelers. For hydrogen, it's an ammonium sulfate fertilizer production facility. We have a tea factory in Kenya, which is being decarbonized through gasification technology. And in Nigeria, it's an innovative energy management system applied mainly to the residential sector. So there's a very diverse range of projects that we can support. And this is just some information about the call if you want to look further. And 2, 1, that's my time up. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Peter. Very, very insightful presentation. And indeed, ADB's energy sector practice teams are looking into those emerging sectors and technologies. And our team in particular is benefiting from a UK-funded grant for smart energy and industrial decarbonization. So thank you. So our guests will have opportunity to ask questions later after the panel. So now we welcome our esteemed panelists on stage. Please come to the stage as I call your name. We have Yoon Soo Kim, Senior Investment Specialist from the Private Sector Operations Department of ADB. She is covering projects in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. She will be giving us insights into the financing of offshore wind projects. Please also welcome on stage. Please give a hand to our speaker. Please also welcome on stage Mudit Parashar, who is the CFO of Green Hydrogen Business and New Businesses for the Acme Group. Acme Group is one of the leading global sustainable and renewable energy companies and a beacon of innovation in the sustainable energy landscape for the past 2 decades. We also have Sora Kaura, Senior Investment Specialist from the Blended Finance team of PSOD. He will be enriching our discussion to share the roles of blended finance and de-risking mechanisms, especially in emerging technologies. And last but not the least, Jussi Ahonen will be joining us on stage. He is a Principal Investment Specialist at ADB and leads ADB Ventures, which is responsible for early stage and high risk investments in ADB. Please give a hand to our esteemed panelists. Okay, to kick off our discussion, I would like to ask Mudit and Jussi, who I know have different perspectives coming from the client and MDB sides, on what you see as the biggest opportunities in applying innovative financing solutions to accelerate growth of new energy technologies. Okay.
So I think when we look at the opportunities, essentially innovative financing, to my mind, and particularly the world where I come from, which is developing projects, it's essentially trying to allocate risk. So you're trying to find capital providers and you're trying to identify who can take how much risk. So I think in looking at opportunities, one needs to see areas where either there are existing frameworks where such, and I'll try to be specific as well, where there are existing frameworks that allow such risk allocation, or you have sponsors and I would say stakeholders coming together, to do this risk allocation. If specifically we talk about, let's say, we're developing projects in the area of green hydrogen and derivatives. In green ammonia, we're building a fully financed $700 million project in Oman. But the other interesting project that we're talking about, where some of what I'm saying becomes more relevant, is a project in Japan, where essentially through a contract for difference scheme, METI, which is the nodal kind of government organization, is coming in and furthering the decarbonization agenda. So that's one angle. Developers, being us, the sponsor, comes together to form an SPV where our partners, which are Japanese off-takers as well as aggregators, come in. The local state government comes in, with a certain amount of subsidy, and with this you kind of put together a project. Now, if there are opportunities, I think which need to be explored, they will, and particularly for large ticket, projects which can make an impact. I think it requires to scout for areas where all this can come together through the government, through sponsors, and then, of course, the most important part of the puzzle is the innovative financing mechanisms that come in. So, I think that's how one needs to look at where opportunities can be.
Thank you, Mudit. And you see?
Thanks, Mudit, for those views. And maybe I will just add that from my point of view, the biggest opportunities come from a very early stage. So when you look on the companies that have difficulties to attracting funding before they are profitable. So these are companies that have very high impact, and often these companies are the ones that are looking to innovative solutions to solve some of the biggest climate problems, and this could be into clean energy or EV or anything, but usually these companies are finding new ways to tackle these problems, but having difficulties of attracting funding. And I do see that just this early stage market is the biggest opportunity from impact investor point of view.
Thank you, Mudit. And you see, we dive deeper now into the tools and strategies that can help unlock capital for these technologies, starting with the role of blended finance. So Saurabh, coming from your perspective and experience, what do you think is the role and the different blended finance instruments that can be used with different financial products for emerging technologies?
Yep, thanks, Indy, and that's a good question. So, blended finance, if you see by the name itself, blended finance is blending commercial and concessional capital. And the purpose is to achieve a development outcome. Now, when we look at the risk ladder, blended finance, instruments could vary from grants to senior loans. Typically in the private sector, grants are used with a convertible option. These are for early stage technologies. And beyond grants, then we come to debt. Typically, debt tends to be subordinated to commercial debt, and it's structured to address certain risks that projects have. So, in a nutshell, concessional debt is debt that takes the same risk as commercial debt but expects a lower return, or asks for the same return but takes a higher risk. Coming to equity, and this is a structure that is becoming popular now. A lot of concessional equity is now being invested into funds, and typically concessional equity gets funded in the first loss. It is used to fund the first loss tranche, and the objective is to crowd in institutional investors in the senior tranche. And the basic philosophy is that any investment manager needs a track record for technology, needs a track record for sector to attract institutional capital. Many of these sectors, new technologies don't have that. So therefore, there is an additional de-risking needed from concessional to help crowd in institutional capital. And once they get comfortable with the risk return profile, and once these funds develop a track record, slowly concessionality can be reduced over a period of time. Another basic fundamental here is, so as I said, concessional capital can take different risks. It's also important to note that donor capital also is not very homogeneous. There are some donors which expect their capital to be returned, of course, with returns which are lower than market. So, as an institution, we typically use this type of donor capital for senior loans with a lower return or subordinated debt. Donors which have a high risk appetite, which is, they are willing to lose their capital. That kind of capital usually gets used in first loss, in funds to fund a first loss tranche or to invest, equity in early stage companies. So it's a mix of what the market needs and what the donor risk appetite is.
Thank you, Saurabh. Building on that, how do you see financing mechanisms be structured to catalyze greater investment in emerging clean technologies, particularly in sectors where traditional investors are hesitant due to perceived market risks, but the potential is high?
Thanks. So I think one needs to think the overall journey of the company. So you have the whole life cycle where you start in the very early stage and then develop to later stage, you go past the value death, and then it becomes scalable. And I think the financial solution should be tailored accordingly. So when we start from the very early stage of companies, there's the seed capital, there's more concessional type of capital that has to be flexible. These companies don't have cash flows to support their growth. So that's where the grants, donor type of funding comes into place. And these companies also need much more than just money at that stage. So it's lots of support in mentoring, support of thinking their business model, how it will evolve to become investor ready. And as these companies start to evolve, also the funding solution should evolve. And that's where NDPs can play a role, because we can, obviously on the other hand, we can always attract concessional capital. That's where we can bring that on. But we can also use the mobilization, as Craig mentioned in his opening. So that's where we are very, very strong. And once the companies develop further, we should start crowding the private sector into the game. And our solution should also evolve from early stage seed to equity to debt as these companies develop further. So it should be always meaningful and structured accordingly, that is supporting these companies' growth journey in the best way.
Well, thank you. And I guess us in the sovereign operations are in the right track. Thank you. So now, Mudit, from the developer's perspective, given the evolving decarbonization landscape and the emergence of new sectors or technologies, how should institutional capital look at evaluating the risks associated with untested technology or emerging sectors?
Sure. I think, as developers, and again, I'll speak more from the point of view of, large project development. So, I think there are two ways, that there are two broad categories. I think there is, as you mentioned, there is a technology risk angle, and then let's call it emerging sectors, which may have various connotations in terms of new markets or new themes or new trends that are requiring the introduction of that particular business. At least, from a green ammonia, green hydrogen perspective, it gets referred to a lot as new technology risk, but we really feel that often institutional capital sometimes, in our view, exaggerates that risk, because at the end of the day, if you break up the value chain, nothing in the value chain is new. Ammonia has been in existence for years. The electrolyzers have been produced, and energy is energy. It's just that now we're using renewable energy. So the only extent of risk that probably comes in is to match the profile, because solar is produced during the day and so on. But all of this can be demonstrated and has been now working with electrolyzer manufacturers and so on. So especially I'm talking about the green ammonia side. I think the other aspect, which is how do you look at evaluating risk in newer sectors? I think, again, it comes back to risk allocation. And more importantly, the way I characterize it is to say that if you can develop a framework where it is a non-zero sum game, in the sense that if you have a developer consortium, so in our example for the Japanese project, for example, ACME owns 60% of the project entity, whereas the consortium of Japanese own 40%, one of whom is also the aggregator and therefore the off-taker, and some are the end customers. So a take or pay contract, therefore, does not become a zero-sum game saying that if I lose, you win, or if you win, I lose, because there are people sitting on both sides, and I feel that gives institutional capital the confidence, to say that, okay, there are people who are sitting on both sides, and it is in their interest to make this project happen. And that could be, that really is one way to look at, or the one way to solve new sector risk, especially as, green ammonia is being used, and it'll vary from country to country, but Japan is trying to use it for co-firing. So how do you bring players from the ecosystem together and make them stakeholders in a, like I said, non-zero sum game relationship?
Thank you, Mudit. Indeed, catalyzing investment is just one part of the equation. Now, I know a lot of you have questions regarding an important aspect of financing, which is reducing risks to make projects viable at scale, right? So again, I would like to ask Saurabh about some examples where blended finance has helped to de-risk a financing structure. I mean, risk allocation has always been Mudit's.
So there are two examples which I wanted to give. One example was a wind project in Laos, and the main risk of that project was it was not a take or pay contract, it was a take and pay contract. And the risk was that there was no assurance from the off-taker that grid will be available 100% of the time. And that was a big risk, that was a big bankability risk for that project. What we did through blended finance in that transaction was we brought in different types of concessional capital, and we created a reserve in addition to DSRA. So it gets a bit technical. This was a reserve that was created for curtailment purposes, and this was in addition to DSRA. This allowed that basically covered for 12 months of extreme grid curtailment if it was to happen. In addition to creating a curtailment reserve, we also structured a reimbursable grant facility, which was funded through a donor fund, and it was for scenarios where for 2 years there's continuous grid curtailment. So very low likelihood, but the impact will be big. So with this curtailment facility, we could actually crowd in private sector commercial banks in this deal. So this was one example where we used blended finance to de-risk the most risky part of the transaction. The other example which I wanted to give, it was not a de-risking transaction, but we did this, but this is more to do with new technology adoption. And this was a recent transaction we did in the EV space. And the way we looked at this transaction was that any new technology adoption takes time, and it typically follows a S-curve. So it takes time to reach a tipping point. Usually it is 5-10% market share. And once it reaches that 5-10% market share, it takes off the market share. And what we structured the concessional finance in this transaction in a way to accelerate the initial time. So instead of taking 5 years to reach 5% market share, we structured an incentive in the facility that if it were to happen in 3 years, the interest rate will be stepped down. So it incentivized accelerated adoption of technology. And the idea here was, can we accelerate, can we beat the S-curve, and can we accelerate adoption of new technology?
Thank you, Saurabh. Okay, now you see, I mentioned earlier that you're leading ADB Ventures, which is responsible for backing bold technology startups with solutions that transform lives and impact society. We know that many emerging clean technologies struggle to transition from early stage pilots to commercial scale. You mentioned the model earlier, but what role can catalytic capital play in bridging this gap and accelerate the transition?
Yeah, I think one is to first understand the opportunities you enter. So once you made your choice on the sector wise where you enter, and then as a catalytic investors, that's a strong signal to the market already. That once ADB has decided to invest in certain segments, that should give the signal to other investors that this is something that we believe in and we are so willing to support. So we should, as I mentioned earlier, we should look these companies' life cycle, not just getting them through the early stage, first round of funding, but how we can support them to the level where they can attract private capital. So there are a number of kind of innovative funding solutions. One can help these companies to get past that really difficult stage of early stage, the value of debt, as we mentioned. One could be like we did at ADB Frontier. So this is not ADB Ventures, and we are piloting something that is called revenue-based funding. So this is in the smaller markets where we don't necessarily see that there are short-term exit opportunities for equity type of capital. We structure the funding in the debt product, but that is based on such a flexibility that the company repays as they generate revenues. So that is obviously meaningful for this company, that the capital is not tied just for repaying funders, but also that is such a structure that gives funders some sort of return. And as you mentioned earlier, many of the donor capital funders do expect some level of return. And that's where we can find that balance. But I think it's just key is to find what is meaningful for these companies, well, what is needed, and then design accordingly so everyone can benefit.
Thank you, and that's really interesting. Let me go off script for a moment. You mentioned, ADB Frontiers. What sort of TRLs are you looking at? I mean, Peter mentioned TRL 3 to 4. My team is actually comfortable at 7 to 9, but they are also looking at 5 and 6. Yesterday, we had floating PV and BESS sessions with the Norwegians and the Swedish governments, and a lot of them are interested in piloting, but we struggle to find the financing. So is that something that could be supported?
Well, I'm smiling. I'm not engineer, so I'm not looking this technology levels, but what we look is the stage of companies from their operational level, how far away their operations is from generating first revenues, then what is the path to profitability or scalability. And with Frontier, we are not just looking technologies, we are looking very simple real-life solutions to emerging markets. These are small markets, right? So, it's not always technology company that will transform the whole world. These are companies that will transform their village or the societies where they operate. So these are important companies in that sense, and that's why we are not just looking at the technology. Where in ventures, we are taking that technology angle very, very differently, and we are looking at the scalability, like how we can solve the climate problems in Asia. But yeah, keep repeating myself, there's not one single solution because the problems are different.
Okay, but be prepared to one of my team members to be approaching you at some point. Peter Bohm is looking at these particular technologies for our team, particularly for the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Anyway, so going back to script, I would like to ask Sue, our only lady in the panel, around offshore wind. It is capital intensive and technically complex compared with the traditional wind projects. So what are the distinguishing characteristics and technical aspects that set offshore wind projects apart from other renewable energy projects like solar or onshore wind?
Thank you. The offshore wind projects are seen different because it requires a larger scale of investment, and also it's more complex to build, and also like other distinguished features. Usually, it's considered having the risk profile different from other renewable or other conventional power projects. One of features different in offshore wind projects is the project usually have multiple contracts, and then the project company has to manage these interface risks between those contractors. Those contractors can be 3 or 4 contractors, but it can also be like 12 to 15 contractors, like a turbine manufacturer, like a pile, like onshore, offshore, like cable, and the transport vessels. So there are many like diverse specialties required to build like one offshore wind farm. Compared to the other usual power project, usually having a one EPC contractor wrapping the whole responsibility of the construction. But this has been generally accepted so far globally on this practice. It's because mainly so far there's no one like to assume this responsibility because it's too risky, and it also have a very wide range of the specialty required. And if we find one contractor to want to do that, it becomes too expensive and not becoming economical. So those aspects are very carefully we have to review. And the other facts different is because the infrastructure is built in the middle of the sea, so we have like a more prone to the weather risks, for example. So, for example, like if there's like a small delay on like parts delivering like 2 weeks a month, this can, if we miss this installation window, it can have like much longer delay because of this specific weather window we have to consider. But then there are like positive aspects because in the sea it has like less land issues, less resettlement issues, and less issues for the population like around the infrastructure, so the noise and all. And also more stable wind speeds, so kind of they have some advantage to being on the sea. And then the last one I want to touch upon is it requires some important like supporting infrastructure, which is usually outside of scope of the project, like port, which requires for the logistics for the construction and maintenance, and also the grid. So usually offshore wind projects have a larger size of power, so we have to make sure that the grid has to be in place so that the project has minimized their curtailment risks. So all in all, the offshore wind projects have bigger risk on the cost and the time overrun. And then, so it has to be very carefully due diligence, and then it has to be the extra care on the sufficient buffer on the cost and time, the built into account when we design and structure the project. So these are specific features on offshore wind project.
Thank you, Sue. That's very interesting for us. We are trying to develop offshore wind in Azerbaijan and also in the Philippines. So we'll be reaching out to you at some point again. Okay, so de-risking helps open the door, but long-term success depends on whether projects are truly bankable. So we now explore the factors in considering bankability and market dynamics. So Mudit, as you know, Asia and the Pacific is a unique region geographically, economically, and geopolitically. Every country in the Asia and Pacific has unique perspectives on all these things. Now the question is, do you see any macro drivers that are determining the direction that different geographies and economies are pursuing for decarbonization? And how does this affect the bankability of projects?
No, you're right, Cindy. I think when we even again, as a developer, when you start looking at opportunities, I think it's important to align, because, as it is, climate financing is challenging. It therefore becomes all the more crucial that you align with the broader goals and objectives, and decarbonization is one area where countries, for geopolitical or other reasons, have taken very different approaches and have different pathways. If we just take, again, I'll cite a couple of examples to make the point. And some of these things also come because of the specifics, the countries and the practical realities they have to deal with. So, for example, in Asia, Japan or some of the, even Korea or other countries, most of the emissions are coming from obviously electricity. In the case of France, it's transportation. Japan has taken a view that they will take a far more longer term, like a glide path, to decarbonization of the electricity sector, using initially co-firing and then going for maybe mono-firing. Whereas Europe, on the other hand, is kind of they've shut down the coal plants. Japan has taken a far more bottom-up approach in terms of PPP driven, whereas Europe has taken a view that it's more call it incentivizing or penalizing, top-down kind of an approach. And similarly, when it comes to specifics, if you look at these countries, like particularly the Asian island nations, and I think Japan is a good example because it has all these characteristics, and yet it is a little ahead, so it's a good economy to look at. It's characterized by a grid that is not very connected, and the cost of renewables is high. So they necessarily and even historically have had to depend on sourcing resources, whether it be it energy or natural resources, outside. And they've kind of taken an approach where, using this CFD program and using some of the large Japanese enterprises, they've created an opportunity for suppliers from all over the world, to come in. And in the case of, I'm talking specifically about green ammonia, to come in and supply what can be we think a fuel of the future. So I think whereas Europe, I think has taken a different approach, towards this, and that's how I think some of these macro trends. I think in Europe it's more, at least from what we're seeing, it's more individual, enterprises on the green hydrogen derivative side, who for their own reason, because either incentives or penalties that have been created, are sourcing it. But otherwise, they're using, because they want to use green hydrogen. If they import it from outside, then you can't do that because hydrogen has issues of transportation. So if you bring in green ammonia, you have to crack it back into hydrogen that has its own wastage, and you lose efficiency. So I think this is how in India, for example, I'll take one more example and maybe leave it there. India has taken a very strong path towards energy independence. So which is why they have taken a conscious call that India will not do, when India says clean hydrogen, they mean only green hydrogen. The idea is not to go to blue and then to go to green. India has kind of taken a call that we'll go straight to green, because it also helps the country in delinking from fossil fuels, and energy independence is a big driving force, in India today. And renewable energy is, one would say, abundantly available. So they're kind of saying that, look, therefore, if green ammonia does become, or green hydrogen and derivatives do become the fuel for the future, that's where we want to go, because it also substitutes, the crude oil and the resources that they have to bring in. So, that's how these macro drivers are, I think, changing how each country is playing this. And as developers, that's how you need to align the projects that you want to progress.
Yeah, that really brings to mind what happened in Japan on the emergence of floating PV, because they had to rebuild after Fukushima. And so government instituted something like 50 cents a kilowatt hour for solar. So there was a proliferation of floating PV because they had no land as well. So that really one type of driver that can drive emerging solutions.
And that's a great, even for example, a lot of these things have to be centrally driven and goes back to the, what we were saying earlier, that framework that has to exist. Even in India, I think what's happened in the last 12 to 13 years on the solar side, primarily one would argue driven by, the government that has pushed it and the Solar Energy Corporation of India playing kind of a nodal agency role. I think that's been, in fact, even in green ammonia, the government has now entrusted the Solar Energy Corporation to be a sort of an aggregator for fertilizer demand, which one wouldn't, because in India, you can, if you're using different industries to ministries of the government to work with each other, that's not the kind of default thought that would come. But I think the countries have to be, innovative and try to, push this centrally coordinated approaches.
And the needs. I have a couple more questions, but I think it aligns well with one question from the audience. I'll read the question from the audience. So the potential of implementing inclusive safeguards, or ESIA, gender analysis, GLI, impact assessment, early in project design is often overlooked as a tool to unlock and de-risk more investments, to enhance project bankability, to boost investor and community buy-in, and to avoid project delays. So do panelists implement inclusive safeguards as tools to also de-risk financing mechanisms? Anyone?
Yeah, I can go first. So if I heard it right, is that doing the social due diligence, taking gender into action plans can help to de-risk the financial risk. Was that understood correctly? Okay. Yeah. So experience shows that, of course, the companies that take, for example, gender inclusivity seriously in their agenda tend to be also responsible in other areas such as finances as well. So and having that inclusive environment in these businesses is definitely positive signal for investors, because you are having a business there where there are more opportunities to everyone. You are obviously benefiting from the wider pool if you look into both genders, and generally you are tapping into more sources of capital because you are operating in a responsible manner. But I'd say this all starts also from the funders' point of view, that they need to take these ones as a requirement in their processes. So it's not just looking to companies that are already there, but also looking to companies that have willingness to get there. So it's not that we should be just looking ready models that are perfect in every area, but we should look to founders and owners that are willing to change their business towards that commonly shared target. So this is important, and I think this is something where we, as a development financier, can bring value.
Thank you. Yeah, Mudit?
Yeah. I think the point I'd make is that I agree, and essentially, if you look at it from a developer's point of view, having someone like an ADB or any of the MDBs, I think it does a lot to the credibility of the organization. I'll go back to the remark Craig had made, saying that you guys, the developers are doing the work and we're just doing nothing. I think that's obviously the fact that ADB is a custodian of so many social objectives that the poorest and the poor of the world are looking to be met. I think an imposition of some of those requirements on these projects is almost critical, I think, and especially for projects that are operating at these scales. So I think the role that MDBs play is absolutely, I mean, it's indispensable, because some of these projects, without, I think, the presence of these MDBs, who knows what could have happened in terms of the adverse impact they would have created if these guardrails hadn't been there. And it's just not for as much on social aspects as on environmental as well. So I think it's almost it's a great driver project developers, to have something like that.
Yes, Sue?
Yeah, just one thing to add, being like having the leading the project from the MDB. So yes, it is important, environment and social, and those are like long-term effects, and like it makes the project safer for the long term. But it is true that so the MDBs have more stringent environment and social requirement, and then this one is sometimes the developers complain because it takes more time. It probably takes a little more cost. So what we try to engage is we try to engage like as early as possible for this, particularly for this ENS aspect, so that when the more at the earlier stage, when we engage, like when they start the environmental assessment, and they make sure that they are aware that the requirement from the MDBs. So that's kind of how we can make sure that these ENS requirements are well in place on time, and not having like further bottleneck in the later stage.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. Saurabh? Okay.
Just one line. So, ENS risk is, they usually, it manifests itself into a credit risk or an investment risk. So, we have to see it in combination.
Sorry about that.
No, I was saying ENS risk is, eventually it becomes a credit risk or an investment risk.
Yes.
So therefore, investors and financiers are aligned.
It's a big consideration. So we have room for one more question from the audience. If you have a burning question, please stand up, share your name and your affiliation. Please, don't be shy, okay? Please, come on.
Thanks for those insightful discussion. This is Bob Nemoe from Fiji. Just wondering aloud, because Fiji has got a pipeline of projects, and we're looking at a tune of around $2 billion over the next 4 to 10 years. So hearing the discussion on the floor in terms of innovative funding, so how Fiji can access some of this funding, for example, de-risking the project in terms of blended financing, and look at other means of innovative financing so that it can make the projects bankable and viable. So I would like to hear from the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, and it's a good question. So from the early stage point of view, we launched ADB Frontier in Fiji earlier this year. So we have a funding facility available and team in Fiji that are looking to early stage SMEs in the country. So this is obviously something new, but we are looking to make a significant number of investments in the region in the short term.
Maybe I can add. So many of the donor funds that we manage in ADB, they do target, we have targets to allocate capital into SIDS, and Fiji is one of the biggest countries. So there is supply available of donor as well as commercial capital. I think what we need is projects which we can bank.
Okay. So, yep, okay. Sue?
Just one example from the MDB perspective, like in Fiji, for example, we had this one, the technical assistance on sustainable aviation fuel project for Fiji Airways, for example. So kind of when in the early stages, and what the ADB, like MDB can do is kind of putting public sector and private sector together. So kind of there are angles that the public sector can do, like a technical assistance or kind of more upstream work with the government, and then those kind of tagging along with the private sector development. So kind of we can see all together like as a package with the public sector and private sector funding. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've come to the end of our panel discussion. And thank you so much to our esteemed panelists for sharing their expertise, experience, and valuable insights. If everyone could give them a round of applause. Thank you. Now, I would like to welcome back on stage Craig Roberts to deliver his closing remarks.
Okay, so before I do, I'm just going to try and answer that question. Thank you for that question. My first piece of advice, we've got a great team on the ground in Fiji. So in our country office, and we've managed to put a few private sector folk as well, there's a team ready to do business. And we're very conscious that to an extent, the Pacific has been underserved. And watch this space, because we hope to be able to ramp up in 2025 what we're able to do in the Pacific, particularly from the private sector deployment and mobilization side. And that's what I would say to everybody. Our panelists talked about, talked all the way from venture and startup capital to new technologies to very large projects. There's a huge spectrum of projects and innovations that underlie some of what we've been talking about. Be assured that it is ADB's mandate both to deploy and mobilize private sector capital right across that spectrum, and we have the tools to do it. So I just wanted to say thank you. I wanted to say thank you to Peter for that wonderful broad overview of what's happening in the market and sources of finance. You said you're going to be particularly interested in the critical minerals session tomorrow. I'm going to do better than that. I've got somebody at the back of the room I want you to meet that I messaged to go come down, because we're looking, we've actually got somebody on board, and we're now looking at private sector around, well, what can we do in that space? And a lot of what you were saying really resonated. So let's make that connection. I'd like to thank Mudit, I'd like to thank Yunsu, Yussi, Surab, and of course, Cindy. A great session, and maybe just some reflections before we leave the room. First of all, we need to move faster. The technologies are emerging, demand is clearly growing, and the climate crisis is deepening. We've got to accelerate the deployment of clean energy solutions, not just in mature markets, but in all of our developing member countries, and particularly in frontier and vulnerable regions where the impact of that crisis is being felt the most. Secondly, we need to be really bold in how we structure finance. We've got to be better at using the tools that we have. So blended finance, catalytic capital, risk-sharing tools. These are not just buzzwords, but they are very important tools and essential instruments to unlock private investment in high risk, high impact sectors. And I like what Mudit said, and I think I sort of said it at the beginning, that much of this isn't really high risk, right? A lot of the technology is there and works. A lot of the concepts are there and work. We're just doing something slightly different, but we have to persuade everybody that that's the case. So we've got to continue to refine our tools, scale our tools to serve the market. Thirdly, and very importantly, we must be inclusive. Financing models must go beyond just commercial viability, although that's critically important. They've also got to support gender equity, local communities, and climate resilience. They've got to support energy security, access to energy, job creation, economic growth, environmental sustainability, and climate resilience altogether. Finally, all of us in this room, all of us in this building, all of us at this forum need to work together, because this is a very, very big challenge, and it's beyond the means of any one organization, any one company to do that, any one government to do that. So we've got to make sure that we're driving very deep collaboration between governments, MDBs, private sector, and innovators across the region. I think ADB is particularly well placed to do that because our sovereign and non-sovereign approach is under one roof. As somebody said at a session on lead pollution the other day, we all get in the same elevator, and that drives collaboration. I wrote that down. I'm going to send that to the person who said that and go, I'm using your quote. So let's take the momentum from today's discussion, turn it into action, and let's continue to challenge assumptions. Let's continue to build partnerships and unlock the capital and creativity needed to power a cleaner, more inclusive future for Asia and the Pacific. And the power to do that is in this room. It's in this building. It's at this forum. It's within the region. So thank you to our speakers and panelists, and thank you to the audience for coming and engaging. Thank you very much.